Hi everyone, how are you doing today? I am back with a book review of Dracula, but first of all, let me just say thank you to everyone who subscribed recently. If you're new here, I do relaxing, some might say ASMR like book reviews of classics, nonfiction history, and more lately some contemporary literature. If you've been around on the channel for a while, thanks for sticking around. Sorry for the absence, but I am just happy to be back. This book is one that my wonderful boyfriend got for me. We were at a secondhand bookstore, and some of you know how much I love these Wordsworth classics. And so I was really excited to find one for Dracula because I haven't had a good copy of this. I've only had that penguin cloth-bound copy, which you know how I feel about that. So this was very exciting, and I just jumped right back into the book. The first time I read it was in 2012. I was in my second year of college, and it was a really great year. I was learning a lot of history at the time, and Dracula was one of those classics I'd just never encountered before. And again, one of those books you think you kind of know something about, but I loved it. And so I was curious what I would think of it now. So, I've read Dracula a second time. I'm going to try to avoid spoilers in the first half of this review, but I will let you know if I share any spoilers later on. So, this book, for those of you who don't know, is written as a series of journal entries and diary entries and phonograph entries. So, I wasn't even aware that people spoke into phonographs like diaries back in the day. I mean, obviously we do that now with our phones, but I just thought that was cool. There's also some newspaper clippings and telegrams. And I've always loved that about Dracula, but it feels kind of more real because it's using these different formats, this mixed medium, if you will. And that was something I enjoyed also about The Woman in White, which I also reread in the last couple of years. It also lets you get different characters' perspectives. Now, I didn't feel that perspective shift quite as much in this book. In fact, upon rereading it, sometimes I thought I was listening to one character and was actually a different character. So not quite as impactful in that way as The Woman in White was, but it's still a fun and enjoyable way to read a novel. And so we start out with Jonathan Harker's journal. Jonathan Harker is a young lawyer who is on his way to the mountains of Transylvania. And, the Carpathians, to be more precise, is the name of the mountains. But he's going there to meet Count Dracula. I always found this strange, but he's going to Transylvania to help Dracula get a house in England. I'm not sure why he had to go all that way to do that. I don't think it's really explained, but anything for Dracula, I guess. And so the first part talks about Jonathan's harrowing experience at this castle and this mysterious white-haired, sharp-toothed gentleman that he meets there. Really a great opening for a novel, and I feel like Stoker really just goes he just goes full blast ahead on all the scenes in the first half of the book. There's some really fantastic scenes, very cinematic scenes. In fact, there was a movie made recently called The Last Voyage of the Demeter, which is about the shipwreck that happens in Dracula. So, Dracula's got castles, it's got shipwrecks, it's got all kinds of things. And I really enjoy these Gothic novels because they are very over the top at times. They can be very melodramatic. I thought Dracula was extremely melodramatic this time around. Some very long-winded speeches by various characters, like just a little cringy sometimes. But it's just sheer escapism, and if you need a little escapism in your life, I think this is a pretty good option. I just think there is too something a little more substantive here especially in how it really dives into this good versus evil struggle, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I just think this is one of those books, and I almost am embarrassed to say it, but I think it's one of those books you just read for the vibes, you read for the ride, and it's just a blast. Now, let's talk about a few more specifics here. The story definitely drives the book. The characters this time around, I didn't feel were quite as interesting maybe as the first time I read it. And that's coming right after The Woman in White, where you've got Marion Halcombe, who's just a wonderful, strong female character. And then you've got Count Fosco, who is just absolutely devious and hilarious and disgusting. In this book, you really don't have a character that stands out even to that extent. Maybe Dracula himself, but he's really not on the page much. And the other characters, I feel, are more responsive to him than their own driving forces. And really, all the events are responsive to him. I would say that Van Helsing is still a very good character. He is the doctor from Amsterdam who shows up at the bequest of Dr. Seward, who runs a mental institution in this book. So Dr. Seward asks Van Helsing to help him out with the case of Lucy Westenra, who seems to be having some strange symptoms. And as it turns out, Van Helsing knows a bit about lore and legends and puts them onto the scent that there's something going on here that's more supernatural and scientific. So that kind of back and forth between the science and the supernatural is something that's kind of interesting about Dracula. And I appreciate that Stoker, tried to kind of show that progression, that not all the characters are just, happy vampire believing people. like especially Dr. Seward in this book, it takes him a while to really understand what's going on and accept what's going on. So those parts of the book are actually quite strong. Of course, there's also Renfield, who is the man in the mental institution that Dr. Seward is studying, and he's a very sad case. And I would say maybe the one exception to the character list here, I think he actually does stand out quite a bit and is kind of something of a driving force in places. Yes, I think that Lucy Westenra really grabbed me this time around. So she is, I don't think it's any spoiler really to say that she's one of Dracula's first, one of the people he preys on when he gets to England. And I won't go into details now about that, but I really felt for her this time around. And I think part of it is her story is not really fully told here. And this is something I feel is maybe a Stoker problem. I feel like a lot of the female characters here just aren't given enough emphasis or description, or they feel very helpless in a way. And that's not to say, in the case of Mina, who is Jonathan's girlfriend, Mina's very independent in some ways. She's very smart and clever, but there's still a lack of telling these women's stories other than them being victimized. And maybe that's an oversimplification. You can challenge me on that, but I really did struggle with some of the female representations in here. So anyways, that's kind of a whole other thing, but I feel like a lot of people talk about gender and sex as it relates to Dracula. I don't want to go into that deeply here just because it's been done a lot, and I didn't actually have a lot to say about it personally. I just know that it is an issue and a frustration for myself reading it. So what else to talk about with Dracula? I don't want to go too long here, but I did want to talk a little bit about spoilers. So I'm going to go into spoiler territory here. I mentioned Lucy Westenra, so she becomes Dracula's first victim, or one of his first victims, and The way it works is the way it works. So basically, after she becomes bitten enough times, she becomes a vampire, and the only way to liberate her soul, which is now enslaved to Dracula, is to cut off her head and drive a stake through her heart. So, yes, I was like deeply moved, I guess, by that scene this time around. And I think, again, it's because I didn't really see Lucy as having much of a chance. And first time I read this, I just thought it was weird, creepy, gross. But the second time, I was really feeling just gutted for her. Like, it was very depressing. And I think that that actually is a good segue into the religious/theological themes of Dracula. And what I mean by that is, you can read this on kind of a surface level where you're taking in all these pieces of lore, and some of it's, superstition and lore, and there are actual real Christian themes in the book, surprisingly enough. And interestingly, Stoker amplifies those themes. He actually doesn't draw back at all. Like the prayers, the characters are very prayerful. They're very faithful, and they are, like they have a fear of God. And it's just interesting that rather than kind of just sweeping that aside or glossing it over, Stoker emphasizes that over and over again. And that's one of the reasons I had a huge problem with this idea that any of these characters could be turned into a vampire, because even after they've been bitten, they're completely devout. And it's problematic to me that these characters suddenly have no free will, and that more seriously is the fact that in this lore, their souls are damned to hell unless someone comes along and frees their soul. And by someone, I don't mean Jesus in this case. It is the act of, the mutilation of the body, which is kind of interesting in itself, just because there is some truth in this idea that, well, Christians emphasize preservation of the soul over the body. In the case of martyrs give their lives so as not to deny their faith. But again, the idea that someone would become a vampire through absolutely no input of their own. Like, they're just completely enslaved and cannot escape, even though they have a desire to escape. That's really problematic. And not at all anything like actual Christianity. Again, though, Stoker was not trying to write a Christian novel necessarily. I'm just pointing this out because it's interesting, and I was really nerding out over this. What are some other things that I noticed about the theology? So I think Dracula works so much better if you read it as metaphor or symbolism. I kept thinking throughout the novel, because the characters experience so much anxiety, it feels like Dracula is more of a representation of maybe anxiety or depression, maybe some kind of severe addiction or a illness even. Like, I think if you read it that way, everything makes a lot more sense in this book. And I also appreciated, though, just this delving into spiritual struggles. I think Stoker did not do a very good job of actually representing spiritual struggle from a Christian perspective, if we get into like the details. But if you look at it from more of a symbolic lens, I think he actually did a pretty good job. And it goes into this mental, spiritual headspace that other novels really don't get into. I mean, take The Woman in White, we'll go back to that again. There are themes there of faith in Christianity, but they're really not, anything like a focus of the book. They're more just, they help move the plot along in some cases, but they're not the focus. And here, I think the faith is the focus. Imperfect as the depiction is, it gets you thinking, and yeah, I appreciate it on that symbolic level. Even the symbols that show up in this book are interesting. You've got actual Christian symbols like the Holy Sacrament, which is the bread that represents Christ's body. In some churches, we would say that Christ is present in that bread in some way if it's been blessed. And that is like the most powerful deterrent to Dracula in this book. There is also, like the wild rose. The rose is a Christian symbol already, and that's used to contain Dracula in place. So just things like that were things that jumped out at me. And yeah, obviously not a book that you just take as Christian literature by any means. Although I think it kind of qualifies. It's just that it, again, reading it, you have to kind of just look at the bird's eye view, and the details is where it gets rather muddy. But I did appreciate some of the truths in the metaphor. That's really where I'm getting here. And then last but not least, I just want to say, writing wise, I thought the first 2/3 was really pretty strong. I think it really dragged in the last third. Things got slower. There was just less of interest in the last third of the book. So that was disappointing. Lots of melodrama. I think I mentioned that earlier, and very emotional speeches by characters. It's kind of too bad, because I think the book would be better if it didn't have some of that. But yeah, you just kind of you get to those parts and you just kind of have to smile a little bit. I think I would just say, if you've never read this, give it a shot. I think it's worth at least one read. And I think your first read will be the best read. So there you go. That's all I've got for Dracula. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.